In February 1998, two government departments, the Department for Education and the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, jointly established a National Advisory Committee on Creative and Cultural Education. This was the committee's brief. Now, committees like this, made up of a mix of amateurs and professional educationalists, have exerted a powerful influence over the development of post-war British schooling, and actually pre-war British schooling as well. Of particular salience to this committee, which I'm going to call the NACI Committee, were memories of an earlier committee, the Plowden Committee, which had produced a report into primary schooling in the 1960s. It reported in 1967. And the Plowden report endorsed child-centred approaches to education. It embraced liberal, romantic and social democratic ideals that actually have inspired generations of British primary school and secondary school teachers. Plowden espoused what Bernstein called a horticultural view of child nature and development. And it's fair to say, I think, that the figure of Plowden hovered in the hinterland of this 1999 NACI report as the committee were doing its work. Plowden emerges into the foreground at one notable point in the 1999 report, under the rubric of anticipating legitimate questions that might be asked. And the burning question that might be asked is this a return to progressive ideas of the 1960s? The question, as you can see, elicits a firm denial, but the conclusions of the NACI report led it to be suspected of the very progressivism that it apparently refuted. The key message of the NACI report was this, again, the need for a new balance in education. And the implications of these findings was really that promoting creative and cultural education would require radical revision of existing policy and practice to give greater autonomy to schools and to teachers. Now, this wasn't a message that the government wanted to hear, committed as it was to tighter control of the teaching workforce and the curriculum. And the imposition of, and it was committed as well to the imposition of accountability measures and the standards agenda. So when the government reviewed the national curriculum soon after this report came out, it was very clear that this key message had not been accepted by the government. Nevertheless, the NACI definition of creativity was widely circulated and discussed. The committee members had agreed upon what they called a stipulative and indicative definition. Stipulative in that it stipulates 4 characteristics of the creative process, and indicative in that it points to features of creative processes that the committee wished to encourage for educational purposes. So the 4 characteristics, as you can see, were imagination, purpose, originality, and value. And the definition of creativity was imaginative activity fashioned so as to produce outcomes that are both original and of value. The report rejected elite and sectoral definitions. By that it meant related to a sector such as the arts, and it espoused a democratic definition of creativity as relevant to all human activity and a capacity of the many and not just the few. Now, it's interesting to me to consider the metaphorical dimensions of these definitions. Brookling, in a brainstorm on the subject, identifies 6 metaphors or fields and their corresponding traditions that are associated with these different definitions of creativity. These are them. Now, thinking about the NACI definition of creativity, we see that it explicitly dissociates itself from an exclusive association with the arts. The emphasis on purpose and value distance the definition from associations with play and with generative natural drives. And these 3 associations of giving free rein to artistic expression, of sort of natural development and indulgence in play, were generally most prominent in that highly vilified stereotype of 1960s educational progressivism, the horticultural view of children that had cropped up in the Plowden report and that New Labour was so keen to distance themselves from. On the other hand, the metaphors of craft work, of problem solving, of innovation and invention fitted more readily with the direction of educational policy in New Labour's first term, and these were taken up and promoted through the agencies of the government, thereby ensuring that creativity was subsumed into mainstream discourses rather than occupying a dissident position on the margins. So the Qualifications and Curriculum Authority recommended on its website that schools should debate the characteristics of creativity, but it suggested that they should be debated in terms of the national curriculum. Meanwhile, the agency itself embarked on a 3-year curriculum project to advise schools on how to promote creativity, while Ofsted, the very much disliked inspection agency, National Inspection Agency, conducted its own 2-year survey to identify and document good creative practice in schools. And this work bridged the period into New Labour's second term of office, which began when it was re-elected in 2001. In 2002, the two departments who had commissioned the National Advisory Committee on Creativity jointly launched something called Creative Partnerships. Creative Partnerships was described at the time on its website as the government's flagship project in the cultural education field. It was managed by the Arts Council rather than by the Education Ministry, and its focus was on raising aspirations in schools in areas of economic deprivation. Its original aims were to give children and their teachers the opportunity to explore their creativity with creative professionals. It was also charged with increasing the number of cultural and creative practitioners and organisations involved in education, and with building the capacity of the creative sector to work effectively in schools. Now, by 2008, so it was launched in 2002, by 2008, when it was being wound up, Creative Partnerships had done a lot of work. It had worked with a lot of schools, it had employed a lot of creative practitioners, it had spent a fair bit of money. The second term development of Creative Partnerships was significant in a number of ways. First, its emphasis was on creativity rather than culture. I'm going to call it CP. CP retained its claim to flagship status throughout its life, but the focus quickly changed from being a project about cultural education to a programme about creativity. And the switch from project to programme signified engagement with the sector that was much more dialogic and developmental than was the case elsewhere. So, for example, the literacy and numeracy projects in England had quickly acquired the force of mandatory national strategies, which teachers were obliged to comply with. The CP programme was more organic in nature. It changed as it grew. The aims were articulated differently over time, and they later included the exploration of creative risk-taking and innovation, and Tony Blair's own interest in what education for the 21st century might be. The switch from cultural to creative was important in affirming that CP was not exclusively about promoting the arts. It mirrored a change in terminology within the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, where what had previously been called cultural industries started to be referred to as creative industries. The fact that Creative Partnerships was managed by the Arts Council rather than the Education Ministry was highly significant, in part because it would maintain the focus on investment in the cultural sector, but also because the programme was organised on Arts Council lines, that means regionally rather than centrally. So Creative Partnerships had 36 regions that organised locally and created their own identities and agendas. The national headquarters maintained a dialogue and research engagement with the different regions through visits and exchanges, conferences, a variety of distinctive publications with very high production values, and an extensive and well-maintained website.